This is episode 3 of the Claude for Creative series. Episodes 1 and 2 gave you the tools: the voice capture, the creative Bible, the voice audit, the character contradiction audit, the world stress test, the creative devil's advocate. This episode is about how they fit together into a working creative practice. Not a theory of how they might fit together, the actual workflow I use across 3 pen names, a tarot deck in development, and a portal fantasy series in the architecture stage. What happens in which order, how I move between Claude and the actual writing, and where the handoffs are. I'm going to walk you through a complete creative session from start to finish. By the end of this episode, you should be able to sit down with a project tomorrow and know exactly what you're doing. For anyone new here, quick intro. I'm Amy, lawyer, writer across 3 pen names, tarot deck in development, portal fantasy series, and architecture. Building a suite of AI-powered YouTube channels, trying to exit my 9-to-5 by February 2027. I have a channel called Renaissance because I believe AI will bring in a new renaissance for humanity. My voice isn't my real voice. Australian. Still looking. The first thing to understand about building a creative practice with Claude is that there are 2 distinct modes of work, and they should never happen in the same session. Mode 1 is what I call thinking work. The sessions where you're using Claude to develop, stress test, understand, and make decisions about the project. This is where the voice capture happens, where the creative Bible gets built, where you run contradiction audits and world stress tests. In thinking work sessions, you're not producing prose, you're producing clarity. Mode 2 is writing work, the sessions where you sit down with your creative Bible pasted in, your voice direction loaded, and you write. Claude might be open in a separate window for questions during this mode, but you're not in a back and forth with it. The output of this session is pages. Mixing the 2 is where people get into trouble. The creative drift happens when you're trying to write and also asking Claude to generate things, because the generation pulls you out of your own register and into Claude's defaults. Keep them separate. Thinking sessions with Claude, then writing sessions without it. Let me walk you through what the first 3 sessions look like on a brand new project. I'll use the Portal Fantasy series as the example because it went through exactly this process, and I can show you what each session produced. Session 1 is the Bible build. I described the project to Claude in a paragraph. A 10-book Portal Fantasy series built around 9 hermetic pillars, each governing a domain of the world with its own internal logic. I said, ask me the questions you need answered to be useful on this project, one at a time. Don't stop until you have enough to build a working document I can paste into any future session. 45 minutes and 22 questions later, I had a document that contained the premise, the protagonist's entry point, the 9 pillars and their domains, the rules I'd already decided and the ones still open, the tonal register, the character's relationship to the world's magic system, and the thematic territory the series was going to cover. That document now opens every working session on the project. Session 2 is the voice capture for the specific narrative voice this series uses. The Another World series is written under my real name, which means it has a different voice relationship than the pen names. I brought 4 pages of prose I drafted in what felt like the right register, ran the voice capture prompt, and got back a voice map that identified the specific things my narrative voice for this series does. Long sentences with internal qualification, concrete sensory detail over abstract emotional statement, a particular relationship with time, the way this narrator notices what's about to happen before it does, and the kill list. 5 phrases and constructions Claude defaults to that would immediately signal this wasn't the series voice. That voice map now sits at the bottom of the project Bible. Session 3 is the stress test on the world's architecture. I pasted in the first 3 of the 9 hermetic pillars and ran the world stress test prompt from episode 2. Claude found 2 logical contradictions between the pillar rules, 3 places where the rules were decorative rather than story generating, and 1 gap in the world's internal logic that I'd been quietly papering over because I didn't know how to resolve it yet. The 2 contradictions became story. One of them became the central dramatic problem of Book 4. The gap became a question that now sits in the project Bible under unresolved, needs architecture work. I don't have to have it solved to start writing. I just have to know it's there. After the foundational sessions, the workflow becomes more fluid. Here's what it looks like week to week on an active project. At the start of every writing block, I paste in the Creative Bible. This takes 30 seconds and resets Claude to full context on the project. Then I write. The Claude window might be open for specific questions. How would this character react to this information, given what we know about their wound? Is this scene's pacing consistent with the tonal register we established? But the writing is mine, and the session ends with pages, not analysis. At the end of every significant section, a chapter, an act, a structural unit, I run a voice audit on the most recent 20 pages. Not because I don't trust myself, but because drift is cumulative and invisible from inside. The audit catches it early. Every month, or whenever I hit a decision point I can't see my way through, I run a thinking session. This might be the character contradiction audit on a protagonist who's behaving unexpectedly. It might be the devil's advocate on a structural choice I'm not certain about. It might be a fresh world stress test on new world elements I've added since the last one. The thinking session output goes into the project Bible. New decisions, new voice rules, new world elements, new character insights. The Bible grows as the project grows, which means Claude's usefulness to the project grows with it. I want to talk about managing multiple creative projects with Claude, because this is where a lot of writers either don't try or get confused when they do. The key is that each project has its own completely separate Bible, its own voice map, and its own Claude session history. I don't mix them. The psychological thriller Bible never goes into the cozy mystery session. The sci-fi noir voice capture never gets pasted into a portal fantasy session. The projects live in separate documents, and when I'm working on one, it's the only one Claude knows about. This sounds obvious, but it requires discipline, because the temptation when you have multiple Bibles is to consolidate, to have one document that contains everything. Don't do that. The separation is what keeps the voices distinct. Claude meeting the Cozy Mystery project fresh, with only the Cozy Mystery Bible, is what keeps that project's voice from bleeding into the thriller's register. 3 pen names means 3 completely different creative relationships with Claude. Mara Gray, the psychological thriller, uses Claude primarily for the character contradiction work, because the thriller relies on deep psychological complexity, and the contradiction audit is where that work gets done. Alice Blackmore, the historical cozy mystery, uses Claude primarily for period consistency checks and the world stress test on the historical setting, which has its own internal rules about what was and wasn't possible in a particular time and place. Ash Voss, the sci-fi noir, uses Claude primarily for voice audits, because the noir register is the hardest one to maintain at length, and drift in that one is the most damaging. Different tools for different creative problems. Same underlying practice. I want to end with something that's hard to articulate, but feels important. The thing this practice has changed most isn't my output. It's my relationship with my own creative work. Having to articulate what I'm trying to do, for a session, for a chapter, for a whole project, often enough and precisely enough that something with no prior knowledge of me can work from it, has made me more deliberate about my creative choices than I was before. Not more self-conscious, more deliberate. There's a difference. Self-conscious is when the awareness of the choice interferes with making it. Deliberate is when the awareness of the choice is what makes it a choice rather than a habit or a default. Slide 11. Medium pause. The voice capture tells me things about my creative voice I couldn't have articulated before I had to transmit it. The contradiction audit tells me things about my characters I'd been feeling but hadn't named. The world stress test tells me things about my world's logic I'd been papering over because the paper was comfortable. None of that is Claude's creativity. It's my creativity, made more visible by having to put it into language clear enough for something with no intuition about my work to understand it. The tools work because they require precision, and that precision, across a long project, is what separates a creative practice from a creative intention. Here's what I'd recommend if you're starting from scratch. Pick one project, the one you care about most right now, the one with the most pressure on it, the one that keeps you up at night, in the good way. Don't try to run the full workflow on 3 projects at once. One project, done properly, will teach you more about how to use these tools than 3 projects done lightly. Run the Bible build session. Run the voice capture. Then write. Don't run any more Claude sessions until you've produced at least 20 pages of new material, because the tools are only as useful as the writing they're serving. Claude for Creatives is not a substitute for the writing. It's a practice that goes alongside it. That's the 3-episode series. Voice capture and creative Bible in episode 1, 4 deep work prompts in episode 2, the full workflow in episode 3. The Renaissance Prompt Kit has all 6 core prompts from this series in printable format, with notes on how to use each one. Link is in the description if you want it. I'm Amy. This is Renaissance. Now, go play.